Welcome back to the Working Well podcast. Today is episode 11 of the 52 Life Lessons series. Rated lessons on the list. Not because it's complicated, not because it's abstract, but because it asks you to question something that we almost never pause to question. Your reality. So let me start with a simple question. What is reality? Now, I'm not talking about metaphysics or quantum physics or whether we're living in a simulation. We can save that for some late night conversation over drinks. But for the purposes of this conversation, your reality is what you believe to be true. And the uncomfortable part is that very often, what we believe is not actually true. Now, Mark Twain captured it perfectly in his famous quote when he said, "It ain't what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Now, that quote has followed me for years because it quietly exposes how dangerous certainty can be when it's built on unexamined beliefs. Here's what we know, both experientially and scientifically. We are the sum of all of our previous thoughts, our actions, experiences, interpretations of those experiences. Our brains are literally meaning-making machines. They're wired to create stories about ourselves, about other people, about our circumstances, so the world feels predictable and safe. What's fascinating is that this just isn't philosophy. Cognitive psychology has shown this again and again. Researchers like Elizabeth Loftus, she's one of the world's leading memory scientists, have demonstrated that memory is not a fixed recording, it's reconstructive. Each time we recall a memory, our brain edits it slightly based on our current beliefs, our emotions, and the context we're in. That means the stories we tell ourselves about what actually happened are often shaped as much by the present as they are by the past. Yet, despite knowing this, most people go through life never questioning their beliefs. They mistake familiarity with truth. And when we fail to question our beliefs, we can slowly become what I call prisoners of our own mindset. For those of you familiar with Soren Kierkegaard, he said it, there are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true, and the other is to refuse to believe what is true. And the challenge we face as humans is learning to navigate between these two extremes without fooling ourselves. For me, it's still a work in progress. I'm sure it is the same for you. But the idea is that we're aware of these extremes and we can start to question when we get into each one. And I've been there many times in my life. For decades, I lived with a quiet but powerful assumption. And you've heard it before. It is what it is. I believed my reality was fixed. I believed I had limited agency in many areas. I believed certain doors just weren't open to me because who I was or where I grew up and what I'd taken in school. And the most dangerous part, I didn't even realize that those beliefs were optional. And it wasn't until working with one of my coaches that I began to realize and to see how many of these mental limitations I'd placed on myself. Not because someone else had put them there, because at some point, I started accepting them as the truth, and that truth was incontrovertible. Even when I was presented with verifiable facts that contradicted those beliefs, I still found myself clinging to that old story, making excuses, rationalizing, explaining away the anomaly. And that's when it hit me. The toughest limitations we face are rarely external. They're the ones we place on ourselves. And most of the time, we're not even aware we're doing it. And you've probably heard the Henry Ford quote, "Whether you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're right." And interestingly, this aligns closely with decades of research by psychologist Albert Bandura. He did tons of work on self-efficacy and showed that believing in one's capability directly influences persistence, effort, and performance. And we see this all the time in our personal life, at work, with colleagues, with ourselves. The good news is, if our brains are wired to create stories, and if our reality is largely shaped by those stories, then we may as well choose stories that actually serve us. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean delusion. It doesn't mean blind optimism or pretending that facts don't exist. There's some political figures that maybe believe facts don't exist. But the reality is, we don't have to go off the deep end and just pretend we're living in a simulation and we can do whatever we want. It means consciously interrogating the stories we're running, and asking whether we're aligned with where we want to go. There's even evidence from medical research showing the power of expectation. The same mechanisms behind the placebo effect have a darker counterpart called the nocebo effect, where negative beliefs and expectations can measurably worsen outcomes. They've done studies with poison ivy, where they tell people they've rubbed it on their arms, and people literally break out in hives. There's a massive, powerful connection between what we believe and our physical and mental environment. So we essentially create our reality. What we believe doesn't just shape our mindset, it's like our physiology is involved. That's why we're not saying we need to create everything in our life. We have to interrogate what we believe first, so then we can create it in a new and more productive way for us. I hear a lot of people talk about goal setting, especially at this time of year. Lots of people are setting goals. But before you set these big goals, before you chase growth, before you try and change your habits, I found it's valuable to start asking better questions. When I work with clients, here are some of the most powerful questions that I ask them, or I get them to ask themselves first. Who do I need to become to accomplish this goal? What do I need to believe differently for this to be possible? What thoughts, behaviors, and actions would someone with this result consistently take? And what am I currently assuming that is just the way I am? What are the things I'm believing about myself that aren't true? One of my favorite quotes comes from Terry Pratchett and is spoken by the character Death in his book, The Hogfather. He says, "You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become?" So every meaningful achievement starts with something that doesn't yet exist. And at some point, someone had to believe differently before the evidence showed up. That's what I mean about first interrogating our reality and then believing something that we want to be true so it starts to become true and we live into that. That's part of what growth and goal setting is about. But if we don't interrogate our beliefs first, that's where the challenges come from. Here's a great example from my own life. So I believed that I was bad at public speaking. Now, interesting coming from a professional speaker when you hear that. But I didn't think I was bad at public speaking. I wasn't just uncomfortable. I was terrified. Class presentations, award banquets for my sports. I was a sweaty, nervous, blundering mess. And my body was just reacting before my mind could catch up. So that belief, it became law. I started to believe I'm not a speaker. But here's the strange part. When I started my fitness business, I regularly found myself in front of groups of people. And I wasn't nervous at all. One of my coaches pointed out this and asked a simple question. She said, "Why do you believe speaking is scary when you're doing it successfully every week?" And that question just cracked my mind like an egg. I realized I wasn't afraid of speaking. I was afraid of the specific context that I had labeled as dangerous or scary. But that belief wasn't true at all. But my nervous system didn't get the memo. So recognizing that false belief just took a split second. Because it had been so many years, rewiring the physiological response took a lot longer. The mental response as well. I can recognize a false belief, but having the emotions, physiological reactions of sweating, the narrative or negative thoughts going through my mind, those still show up, especially in new situations. If I get into a situation or speaking to a group of people that I'm not used to speaking to, I saw this when I moved from the fitness industry into corporate. I had imposter syndrome and all these feelings going on. But now I welcome them. I instead of resisting those feelings, I notice them, and I notice them as signals that I'm stretching, that growth is happening, and reminders of all those other false beliefs that I've already grown through. And what fascinated me most was that in health, fitness, sport, my belief systems were rock solid. They were positive, proactive, empowering. I'd assumed that mindset carried over to everywhere else, but it didn't. In areas where I wasn't getting results, I realized that I hadn't interrogated my beliefs at all. Areas like math, believed I was bad at math, finance, the speaking I already talked about, other skills that I quietly decided that they weren't for me. And I realized that this was incredibly common across all the people that I was seeing, my clients on the fitness side, my clients on the executive coaching side. Most people don't lack the discipline or intelligence. they're just operating from outdated assumptions that they've never questioned. So after that speaking epiphany, apparently I can't speak today, I started paying closer attention to how those beliefs showed up in my clients' lives and my own. And that led to what I call my circle of success or distress model and the 4 pillars of performance framework. And that's for another episode. If you want, I'll throw some links in the show notes. But at the heart, it's a simple progression that's captured beautifully by Gandhi's words. And you're probably familiar with this in some way or another. And Gandhi said, your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny. Most people try to change habits without addressing the beliefs behind them. That's like treating symptoms while ignoring the cause. So if you want different outcomes, it's important to start upstream. So let me leave you with this question. When was the last time you interrogated your reality? Not surface level reflection. Forget the positive affirmations, but honest, uncomfortable inquiry into yourself. What stories are you telling yourself about who you are? What assumptions are you treating as facts? What beliefs might be quietly shaping your limits and your capabilities right now? Where in life are you driving with the emergency brake on? And this is one of the most powerful exercises I do with clients. And it still amazes me how quickly clarity appears when someone's willing to question their own narrative. Those voices going on in your head, we all have them. They don't define you. They're there now because of past experiences and beliefs. You can choose to have different thoughts, different beliefs, different actions, different outcomes. So if exploring this resonates with you, please reach out. Witnessing these breakthroughs is one of my favorite parts of coaching. You can find me at timborys.com, on LinkedIn. Just reach out. I'd love to connect. Until next time, think well, live well, and remember, interrogate your reality. That wraps up another episode of the Working Well podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, which guests or topics would you like to see featured on the show? Message me through LinkedIn or on the contact page of timborys.com with your ideas. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tim Borys with Fresh Wellness Group, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.